Okay, so on to the main event. Our guest speaker today is Amanda Dunn. Amanda is completing her MSc in Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University under the supervision of Dr. Megan Winters. Amanda is currently working as the project lead for Pedal Pole 2026 through a research internship funded by MyTax. She completed her bachelor's degree in geography with a focus on human geography at the University of Ottawa. Take it away, Amanda, and we're excited to hear you talk about Pedal Pole.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. So yeah, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Amanda. I'm super excited to present a little bit about Pedal Pole 2026 and what we have planned for this year. Before we start, I also want to acknowledge the support of the other project partners that we have this year. We've had a lot of support from various organizations, and we couldn't do the count without them. So a big thank you to them. I also want to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Musqueam, and Squamish nations, otherwise known as SFU Burnaby campus, and recognizing that we conduct this poll on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across the country. So to start off with a bit of an overview of Pedal Pole for anyone that might not be familiar, Pedal Pole is an annual community science project where hundreds of volunteers across Canada count road and path users to support cycling in their communities. This year it's happening from June 7th to 2nd to 7th, 2026. And again, our goal is the same as in previous years, is to evaluate the state of cycling in our communities, get a snapshot of what cycling looks like in our communities, and be able to build the case for better and more infrastructure across the country. So when Pedal Pole started in 2021, it was a demographic count. So we were looking at who was cycling. It then became a mode share count. So specifically looking at the number of cyclists, pedestrians, vehicles, and oversized vehicles. And this year we're moving on to being more of a micromobility count. So we're counting bicycles, same as previous years, but we're also counting other types of micromobility devices. So our focus continues to be on bikes, but we kind of have different supporting data that is evolving as the different data needs and interests evolve across the country. So why micromobility this year? We know that we've seen significant growth in micromobility across the country, and we've heard a lot of interest in being able to better understand the share of different types of devices, different kinds of bikes, and other micromobility modes like e-bikes, e-scooters, e-motos, and so on. We know that these devices have a lot of benefits. They kind of promote mobility, but they can also present some challenges that we want to address. And the more data that we have, the better that we can kind of address some of those challenges. So I won't get too much into this, but just to highlight that we have data from previous years of Pedal Pole available and the link to that will be posted in the chat. So if you're interested in seeing kind of what we found in previous years, you can check that out. And then I'll get into what our plan is for this year. So how did we decide what categories to count? We know that there's so many different types of micromobility devices out there. And it was, more challenging than I know I was anticipating to kind of narrow down how do we distinguish them, what do we call them, and how do we break it down in a way that will be meaningful for the poll. So this kind of fell into three main steps of the project. So the first thing was we kind of sat down with our internal research team and developed principles to kind of guide our selection. So we were thinking about what are the goals of the count? What are we trying to achieve? What are we using this data for? I then did a bit of quite a literature review, looking at what have other studies done and how do other organizations refer to these kinds of devices. So we were aiming to be consistent and kind of build on what's already been done. And then after developing kind of a first round of proposed categories, is we took that out for external engagement to see how do these proposed categories resonate with volunteers and with other researchers across Canada. And is the definitions, the names, and the pictures that we're proposing, are they clear? Do they make sense? Is there anything missing? So to explain the principles, so here we were first thinking about the overall principles of Pedal Pole, like how does the count work and what are the goals? So the first kind of two elements are thinking about who is doing the count and kind of how it works. So we know that it's done by volunteers across the country. Many volunteers have, lots of experience with micromobility. They might do research in the space, they might work in the space. And then we also have lots of volunteers who are passionate volunteers who might, they might have some knowledge, but they might not have as much in-depth knowledge on the details of different types of devices. And so we were thinking about making sure that categories are easily visible. Like when you're sitting, on the bench and you're watching those bikes and those other devices go by, making sure that it's things that you can easily and quickly spot and recognize. So making sure that our descriptions are simple, that instructions are clear, and that we have visuals to help folks recognize them. And then also thinking of minimizing the number of categories. Again, as you're thinking of those things going by, making sure that there's not, 100 different options that you need to choose between. So we kind of set ourselves at between 8 to 16 categories, and we ended up landing at 9. And then thinking about as we designed the app is making sure that, again, the interface kind of supports quick recognition and being able to very quickly identify where you need to be hitting that button as you see things going by. We were also thinking about data consistency across years. So as you may know, this is the 6th year of the count, and we want to be able to group our new categories into the existing categories of cyclists and pedestrians, to be able to continue to build on the longitudinal data set that we have. And then also allowing a bit of flexibility for the future. We know that these devices are continuing to evolve, and we want to kind of leave it open to make sure that we can continue to capture this valuable data. And then the fourth one, in terms of overall principles, was thinking about alignment with existing taxonomies. So thinking about what are people currently calling these devices across the country? Like what are the names? How are they being described? And kind of selecting those names and terminology that speak as much as possible to work that's already being done. We were also thinking about some of the kind of current trends that we want to be able to monitor to support advocacy. So here are the two main ones. We're thinking about shared micromobility, so systems like Mobi, Bixi, Lime, Neuron, those other shared systems, and being able to distinguish between shared mobility devices and personal micromobility devices. And then also thinking about electrification, we know that e-bikes, e-scooters, and other electric devices have seen huge growth. And so being able to distinguish between kind of conventional devices and electric. And then the final two principles are thinking about how we ensure that the count supports our advocacy goals and supports volunteer recruitment. So first, making sure again that our categories and rationales can be clearly communicated. And part of that is kind of presenting this as being clear about, why we chose different categories and what the goal of each category is. And then thinking about how the categories that we select are going to kind of influence the public discourse on these different types of devices. And so that's kind of coming out in the training material that will be coming out soon, is like how kind of helping people learn to recognize different types of e-bikes, different types of e-motos, cargo bikes, and other devices. We know that kind of e-bikes are one of the big challenges, is that we know we've seen, lots of examples in media where, you'll see that an e-bike was in a crash or, was getting kind of negative attention. And often, you look at the picture and it's not actually something that most of us would refer to as an e-bike. And so it's kind of an ongoing challenge of, being able to communicate like what are these different types of devices. So for the literature review, I kind of looked at three main things. And here again, like this is a complicated landscape. There's kind of at the same time a lot of research and not a lot of research because it is a relatively new area. So I was looking at first research studies, so looking at other studies that have classified micromobility to look at how they did it and what was their rationale for the different categorizations. And looking at other reports from other organizations, so not necessarily reports that explicitly classified micromobility, but also just looking at the terminology that they use, again, to be consistent and kind of reflect what is already out there. And then finally, looking at legislation. So for micromobility devices across different provinces and territories in Canada and at the federal level to see whether that aligns with the definitions that we were proposing. And here I want to highlight that we were looking at if or how legislation defines the device. So how do they define like what an e-bike is or what an e-scooter is? We were not looking at rules around its use. So whether there was, age restrictions or if the device was allowed or not. Because again, we know that they're out there either way and the kind of legislation for them varies across the country. So some of the key takeaways from the literature review with the research studies, the big thing that we saw is that different objectives mean different categorizations. So we saw kind of a good variety of what the researchers were trying to achieve with the study that they were doing, and that kind of informed the categorizations that they used. So some of them, were looking at a lot of different kind of factors, and so they collected much more granular data that they could then kind of analyze in different ways. And some were kind of more looking for just a broad picture of what is out there on the pathways on the roads. And so they had kind of a smaller number of categories. And some had a much narrower scope than pedal poles. So, for example, looking at only electric devices, but all of these kind of looking at all of them together and then comparing and figuring out what our priorities are to help kind of build our first proposal. And then looking at reports from other organizations, so there were a few about shared micromobility, so that provided a lot of good insights on, at first, the terminology, but also insights on the different types of shared systems across Canada and where those shared systems are. Some were about micromobility more broadly, so again, insights on terminology and just different types of micromobility. The goal was really to be able to kind of, look at our categories and make sure that we've covered as many different types of micromobility as possible. I won't say all because I'm sure someone will come up with one that we haven't seen before. But just making sure that we've thought about all of the different ones and where do we want to count them. Some were looking again at only electric micromobility. And then there were several that categorized based on factors that are not easily visually distinguishable. So this was kind of one of the key factors that ultimately determined where some of the devices ended up being categorized, is that some of them classified based on weight or based on the maximum speed of the device. And we know that, again, like when you're sitting there and you're watching the bikes or the devices go by, it's not always easy to tell what their weight is. Like you might be able to guess, but we don't know kind of to the level of detail that these reports were doing. We don't know exactly how much they weigh. We also don't know, like we might be able to guess at what speed they're currently traveling. We don't know what their maximum speed is. We don't know what speed it was designed to travel at. And so those things are a little bit more challenging to distinguish visually. And then legislation, again, here I'm going to kind of caveat that we know that this space continues to evolve. Ontario, for example, we know is currently conducting engagement to kind of revise some of their policy. So this is based on what was kind of current at the time of my research in the past few months. So the first thing we know is that at the federal level, there's very minimal regulation. So for e-bikes, it only applies to e-bikes that are designed to exceed 32 kilometers an hour. And e-scooters were not addressed in any federal laws that I looked at. In terms of definition, so here we were primarily focusing on e-scooters and e-bikes. The existing provincial definitions for e-scooters were largely in line with our proposed definition, which is essentially a two-wheeled device that you stand on. It has a handle. It doesn't have a seat. But there were some that were different. So as an example, in BC and Saskatchewan, they define it as like an e-scooter can have up to 4 wheels. In Quebec, they include e-scooters under a broader definition of motorized personal mobility devices, which must have at least 1 wheel. And then in several other provinces, there were no definitions found at all. In terms of e-bikes, it was kind of a similar picture in terms of the variation. We heard a bunch of different terms. We saw motor-assisted cycle, we saw power bicycle, power-assisted bicycle, e-bike, motor-driven cycle. So again, very similar, but slightly different variations in different provinces. And then we saw differences in definition in terms of the need for functioning pedals. So whether the device needs to have pedals at all, and then the level of assist. So whether, whether the motor can be engaged only by pedaling or if it can also be engaged with a throttle. So there were some provinces that had multiple classifications, like class 1 and class 2 in Nova Scotia, for example, distinguishes those. And then there were others that either don't address it or only cover one of them. And then for external engagement, so once we kind of did those first 2 steps, is developed an initial proposal for the categories that we wanted to count. And then we sent that out to about 90 people who have previously been involved with pedal pole or who we know kind of work or do research in this space. So that included advocacy organizations, researchers, consultants, and nonprofit organizations. And we essentially provided, here's the name, the definition, and the pictures that we're proposing to include to communicate these definitions, and just ask for people's feedback. Do these make sense? Is there anything that you would change? Is there any questions that you have? And we provided 2 options, so they could either complete a survey or they could book a meeting with me to discuss them, whatever was kind of easier. So ultimately, we ended up having 23 surveys that were completed. and 6 meetings that were booked. And then also I've had a good amount of back and forth and discussions with other folks since then as well. So lots of really helpful feedback, which was great to see. In terms of what we heard, so overall general agreement with the categories that we selected. There were a few comments that, we don't need to count this or we don't need to count that. But generally, kind of the categories resonated, which was great to see. We got a lot of feedback on the terminology, so the name, specifically the names of the categories and the names of certain types of devices that were included, and the pictures and texts that we used to describe each category. So I'll mention a few examples in a moment, but that kind of reflected how we refined each of the categories over the next few months. And then the final thing that really stood out to me was the pretty significant variation in terms of the perception of different types of devices and the desire to capture different types of devices. So there were some people, for example, that told me, we definitely don't need to count that. I have no interest in that. And then there were other people that said, we should make that even more granular because I'm really, really interested in that. And so again, this just kind of reflects we see lots of differences across the country in terms of different types of devices that are being used. And yeah, just trying to capture a picture that best represents the different contexts. So some of the specific points of feedback that I'll highlight, and these will make a little bit more sense in a moment. I'm going to show you kind of the final set of categories, but there were a few things that people asked questions about that we used to kind of refine the details of the definition. So the first two related to the difference between bikes and cargo bikes. So folks asked, where do we count bikes with child seats? And when does a bike become a cargo bike? If, for example, it has, a milk crate on the back or a basket or a pannier, is that a cargo bike? Where, how much cargo does it need to hold to become a cargo bike? We also heard some questions about the shared bike and shared e-scooter categories, about whether those might be interpreted as, more than one person on the bike, rather than a bike from, Mobi or Bixi or another shared micromobility system. And so that kind of, we added a few pictures and text to refine to clarify that. And then questions about whether we're counting people and devices. And so here, people or devices. And so here I want to clarify that we are continuing to be consistent with what we did in previous years, which is to count people for cyclists and pedestrians. So if, for example, you see a cargo bike go by and maybe it's a parent on the bike with 2 children on the back, that we're counting as 3 cargo bikes, because our goal is to capture the number of people who are getting around using these different modes. And then there were a few points of concern that we heard as well. So a big one that we heard from a lot of people was difficulty distinguishing between conventional bikes and e-bikes, especially for those e-bikes with internal batteries. So we know that some e-bikes have a battery that can be kind of removed to be charged, and others is kind of built into the bike. And so that's kind of a key point that is difficult to distinguish. And then also on e-bikes is differentiating those that are pedal assist only, so you need to pedal to engage the motor, and those that can be moved using just a throttle. And then terminology for the category that was previously the limited speed motorcycle category, we heard that this is actually a legally recognized name for a certain type of device in BC. And the definition for that was not the same as kind of what we were intending to capture. And so we've revised that one. It's now called the e-moto category. We heard a few comments as well about mobility devices, so things like wheelchairs or mobility scooters being counted as pedestrians. And this was one that we had a lot of discussion about within our internal research team, thinking about where the most appropriate place to count them is. And with this, ultimately, we decided to continue counting them as pedestrians. The main reason being because this is most consistent with what we've done in previous years. We know that their needs are going to be different in many cases than pedestrians, but we also know that we want to advocate for pedestrian infrastructure to be accessible to everyone. And so they'll continue to be counted as pedestrians. And those small non-motorized devices, so things like folks that are on rollerblades or, kick scooters, like manual kick scooters that often children are using, or skateboards, that kind of thing, those again are continuing to be counted as pedestrians, which is partially due to the speed that they travel at, the road space that they use, And also because we know that they're a relatively low percentage of the modes that are out there. And so it wasn't one that was our highest priority to kind of have that warranted having a distinct category. And then some other general feedback. So the first one that was really helpful was the need to show more pictures of adaptive bikes. So just adding to the options that we're showing people to help people recognize different types of devices. And then suggestions on specific examples to include in pictures. So specific examples, like specific brands of e-bikes or e-motos, for example, that might help people to recognize them. And then the general feedback to continue to lean on visuals to train volunteers. So, the training materials will not be, a 20-page report that someone needs to read. It'll be kind of very brief pictures to make it as easy as possible for folks to be comfortable recognizing the things that they're going to see going by. So, to get to the selected categories. So, where we ultimately landed was on 9 categories. What I have on the left here is a screenshot of the app. So, this is what you'll see when you're counting. And we're counting 9 categories. So, they're broken down into different kind of groups based on the colors. And so, we're looking at traditional bikes, which is in the light green. We have electric devices, so e-bikes, e-scooters, cargo bikes, and other electric micromobility in the darker green. We're looking at shared micromobility, so shared bikes and shared e-scooters in the blue, e-motos, and pedestrians. On the right is our current kind of definitions for the devices. So the goal with these was to be as brief as possible to make them easy to understand. And the main one that I'll kind of highlight here is the distinction between e-bikes and e-motos. So one thing that we heard a few times in the feedback, like I mentioned, was to distinguish between pedal and throttle e-bikes. We did ultimately decide to count these together, the main reason being because they're very, very difficult to distinguish visually. When you're counting, unless you happen to be, if the person is starting, right in front of you, you might notice whether or not they're pedaling. Other than that, the bikes look exactly the same. And they're often traveling at similar speeds. So those are going to be counted together. And then with e-motos, we're trying to capture those kind of larger, faster devices that might sometimes be referred to as e-bikes, but are not e-bikes. So things like electric mopeds, electric motorcycles, and electric dirt bikes that are more powerful and faster than an electric bicycle. And some of the key distinguishing things here are pedals, or the lack of operable pedals. So some of them have like super tiny pedals that don't actually pedal the bike, and others don't have any pedal at all. So it's just kind of like a platform for the feet rather than a pedal that can be turned. And yeah, so these are the categories. I'm not going to go super into depth into the details of each one, but I'm happy to speak to that more if folks have questions in the Q&A. So a couple things that we've heard, these came from the engagement and also other discussions that we've had since then. But that device is not legal in my city. Again, I mentioned before that we know that not all devices are legal everywhere. And sometimes it's only in certain cities or in certain provinces that it's legal. But again, we know that they're out there anyways, and we want to be able to get that data on what is out there. And this can also help to support advocacy for regulations and for infrastructure that meets the needs of everyone that's using cycling infrastructure. And then some comments about cities that don't have shared micromobility systems. Those cities simply won't count any shared micromobility, but this was a category that we felt was really important to capture because it helps us kind of build that case for more shared micromobility. So being able to speak to, in the city, in a given city, that whatever percentage was shared micromobility can kind of help us to build that case, even though we know that it will not apply to every city, and it may not apply to the full extent of every city. We also heard some comments along the lines of, I hate scooters, or I don't like this kind of device, or whatever. Why are we counting those? We know that everyone kind of has their preferred type of micromobility device, but we know that the more data that we have, the more that we can kind of advocate for infrastructure that meets everyone's needs. And so we want to have that data to be able to push for, maybe it's a wider bike path to accommodate people that are traveling at different speeds. Maybe it's additional regulations to make sure that all devices being used are safe. And again, having that additional data will help us to do that. We heard a lot of questions and comments about why can't we also count insert other interesting data point. We had lots of really good suggestions of things that would be super interesting to count. So we had some, for example, like interest in counting, what is on different parts of the pathway, like what's on the road, what's in the bike lane, what's on the sidewalk, or counting other kind of breaking down categories a little bit more. The short answer to this is that there's a lot of interesting things that we would love to have data on, but again, it's just kind of that balance between keeping the categories manageable and not having too many while maintaining kind of the main goals of the count. And then the final one here is some concern about, what if you're counting and you see something that you don't recognize? The kind of short answer here is to use your best judgment. So we'll have training materials that will help folks learn and become more comfortable identifying different types of devices. And we'll have a particular focus on some of the ones that we anticipate being a little bit more challenging. But we ask you to make your best judgment. And we know that, again, with kind of a count of this nature, there's always going to be some margin of error. There might be some bikes that get counted as e-bikes and vice versa. But we're really just trying to get that kind of overall picture. So we ask you to make your best judgment there. And then I'll finish off here before we get to the Q&A with just a little bit about how we can use the data. So once we've collected all of this data, we can use it to monitor trends in cycling over multiple years. So we can look at this year's data and we can look at previous years and look at how kind of the share of cycling is changing, the numbers are changing. We can also use it to track the impact of new infrastructure. So maybe you counted at a specific location last year and it was a painted bike lane and now it's a protected bike lane. How does that new infrastructure change what we're seeing? We can also look at use patterns by different times of day. So there's 5 different time slots that pedal pool volunteers count at. And so we can look at those different patterns. We can also look at different types of infrastructure. So one of the things that we do on the back end is we classify the type of infrastructure at each location. And so we can speak to, what is happening on multi-use pathways versus painted bike lanes versus gravel pathways and other types of infrastructure. We can also use it, especially kind of at the local, like in partnership with our local volunteers, to identify any network gaps. So maybe you're counting somewhere and, you see fewer people than you expect. That can kind of help us look at the broader picture of the network of the city and support advocacy for new or improved infrastructure. In some cities, count locations are also used to validate automated counters or to provide additional granularity. So some cities have, like the tubes on the road or other tools that automatically count how many people pass over a specific area, but those are rarely able to provide the kind of granularity that we'll have with this count. So they might count the number of bikes, but we don't know if it's a bike or an e-bike or a cargo bike or an e-scooter. And then finally, again, supporting advocacy for regulation. So again, just having a better picture of what exactly is out there on the roads. The data can be used at both the national and the local level. So we'll be doing some analysis and publishing that. And then all data and results are publicly available at no cost. So again, we'll be doing some analysis and publishing that. And then we'll also be putting out the data in formats that local folks can download and analyze. Maybe you're interested in looking at a specific city or a specific count location, and you'll be able to do that. So a little bit of a kind of sneak peek at what can this tell us? Like what kinds of questions might we be able to answer or learn more about using this data? So we can look at what infrastructure are these different modes using? On a multi-use pathway, what kind of modes are we seeing? On a bike lane, what are we seeing? How does use of, multi-use pathways specifically, for example, how does that vary across different times of day? We can look at the share of shared micromobility relative to personal micromobility. And then looking, again, if we look at, for example, at a more local level, how does the share of bikes compare to the share of e-scooters in your city, for example? Maybe you're curious about that. Maybe you're looking at a specific multi-use pathway near your home where you did a count, looking at, what share of different types of devices are using that multi-use pathway. And then another example could be looking at like how many people use this specific pathway or this area on a weekday at this time versus a weekend at another time, and being able to do that kind of more specific analysis. So I'll finish off with just kind of a general call that we're hoping that lots of you will get involved with the count this year. And there's kind of 3 main ways that you can get involved. So the first one is to sign up to count. So sign up for a count shift in your city or sign up for multiple shifts would be even better. And then helping us promote the count. So whether or not you're able to do a count yourself is share it with your networks on social media, putting it in newsletters. All of those are super helpful. Share it with your friends and family. And then if those aren't enough, if you're looking to get even more involved, is to help us coordinate at the local level. So we have lots of connections with local bike advocacy groups, local researchers, and other um, folks who can kind of play a little bit more of a role in helping us recruit local volunteers. And these are kind of the folks that we lean on if we have questions about a specific location. Like maybe we're thinking about, we have a question about a specific count location, or we have a question about the data when we're looking at it. These are kind of the folks that we'll lean on as kind of our liaison with local volunteers. So yeah, please feel free to get in touch. I know a few links have been dropped in the chat so far. We have the Count website that has lots of information. This email is the best one to reach me if you have specific questions about the Count, or if you want to get more involved, if you're someone that's able to help promote, or if you're interested in being involved as a local coordinator, please reach out. And then, yeah, we're also on social media, and you'll be seeing lots of kind of materials come up there in the next few days and weeks as we get closer to the count. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions now. And yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out if questions or comments come up later as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. That was great. Okay, we've had some discussion ongoing in the chat that I've been trying to collate kind of as you've been finishing up the presentation. So I will just go through some of those questions in the chat. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A, or we can see them in the chat as well. So the first question is, how would you classify shared e-bikes? Montreal's Bixi system has both classic and pedal assist bikes, which are easily distinguishable. Lots of ridership on the e-Bixis with noticeable difference in ridership profiles.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this came up in the feedback that we heard as well in terms of a desire to kind of break those categories down into shared conventional bikes and shared e-bikes. What we ultimately decided is that both of these will be captured together under shared bikes. The reason for that is because we looked at kind of the picture across the country of what cities have shared systems and what kinds of bikes they have. And ultimately what we saw was that there were very few cities, I think it was 3 or maybe 4, that actually have both types. And most cities only actually have one type. They either have only conventional or they only have e-bikes. And they're not necessarily easily distinguishable in all cities. So again, it was kind of that balance of, what is the picture of shared micromobility currently? And yeah, like what is the most important thing is to capture the shared micromobility, because we also know that the shared micromobility companies themselves, they also have data on the level of use of the different types of conventional bikes versus e-bikes.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question. Where do long tail bikes fit in? Are they cargo bikes?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, with cargo bikes, we're looking at the way that we've designed it is, or defined it, is a bike that is designed to carry additional cargo, whether that's additional people or, larger packages. And so a long tail cargo bike with that longer seat on the back is going to be classified as a cargo bike.
Okay, great. This is from Molly, City of London. What about count locations? We've struggled with getting all our locations covered in recent years. Is there a thought to reduce or reconsider locations? And there's a few comments from Samuel saying, reach out to discuss locations. But I'll let you answer, man.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit more to that. We're definitely open to updating locations. We know that, like the context can sometimes change over time. The main kind of considerations that we give to folks in terms of changing them is that we try and avoid removing locations that have had multiple counts in the past, because we want to be able to continue building on the longitudinal data set. If, for example, though, if you're in a city where you've had a lot of trouble filling them, is that it might make sense to reduce it a little bit so you can kind of focus your volunteers on fewer sites. And then we have some areas where folks have been interested in adding locations, which again, we're also open to. Some cities, for example, have noticed that their locations have much more of a focus on traditional commute trips and might not capture other trips, or maybe there's new infrastructure, other things like that. So adding locations is also an option, but again, it's just kind of balancing like what are the current the levels of volunteer capacity that you have. We would rather have, fewer sites that are well filled rather than many sites that only have one or two shifts filled. So yeah, I would say if you're interested in kind of updating locations, just reach out and we can chat a little bit more about the local context.
Great. Next question is from Aiden. Thanks for the presentation. I was curious about what category motor-powered bikes would fall under. They're often traditional bikes with a gas-powered motor installed on the back. Would those fall under the traditional bike category?
Motor. So
Like with
yeah,
a gas motor, not an e-bike.
yeah. So a gas motor, again, this is a good example of there is kind of that a bit of a gray area between those different categories. Um, the devices that are coming to mind when you read that definition to me, they definitely sound like things that we would categorize as e-motos. Because it's kind of those devices that travel much faster, they're heavier and they're bigger. Um, so yeah, I think that would be my best answer to that. I think when you see the training materials, you'll see a couple more examples of like what different devices are. And that's why we're, I think, also trying to lean on what the visuals are more than the words for our definitions, is that there's a million different kind of definitions of different things, like something that we call whatever it is. So we're really kind of leaning on like what does the device look like in terms of distinguishing between different categories.
Uh, Great. Next question from Joanna. How many cities/towns participate? Are there specs on which places in the country participate, or is it based on volunteers and who knows about pedal pool?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm trying to remember off the top. I don't know the exact number of cities that we currently have. I want to say that we're hovering around 20. Samuel, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. But we have like kind of a subset of cities that are kind of our official locations. And so these are the ones that we've had counts in multiple previous years. But we're definitely open to, again, if there's other cities, like if your city is not currently involved, we would love to have you. And we can kind of work with you to kind of select those local locations and make sure that they're added to the map. And we're also, yeah, trying to kind of build our promotions this year to reach as many different people as possible. So a big part of that is working with kind of the local organization, whether it's local bike advocacy or city staff or researchers, kind of anyone in the community who is interested. And yeah, if you're in a city that is not currently captured, please reach out and we can definitely get you added. Um, did I answer all of that? I feel like there might have been one other part to that question.
No, I think you're okay.
Awesome. Okay.
Samuel, go ahead. You're muted. Oh,
Okay. Uh, I think one of our hopes with all of the 41 people who are still on this call is that um, you can be a part in helping us publicize the count. We have a limited list of people who have been involved in the count at some point or another. But there's always people coming and going, and so it's necessary to keep telling people about the count. So when you receive information from Amanda and when you see stuff coming out from our newsletter on social media, please help out by passing that along to the local community, people who are interested in cycling, in health, in research, in city planning, recreation. These are all people who can be invited to support the count so that we can fill those count shifts and broaden the pool of volunteers.
And I think the other thing I'll add quickly onto that is, again, like if you're interested in getting the kind of like raw communications package, we'll have stuff going on our social media that you can repost and share. But if you're interested in having kind of like the initial posts themselves to share, reach out as well, and I'll make sure that you're added to my list. Like we'll have a couple things coming out. Some of it will be social media, some of it will be kind of newsletter blurbs that can be easily added into various newsletters. And then also we're kind of getting creative this year with a couple other things that we haven't done before. So even just like posters that we can put up at bike shops, and some other ideas that, if you're interested in getting those, send me an email as well, and I'll make sure that you're on the list.
Awesome. There's a few questions about the data collection itself, so I'll try to kind of collate them. The first one is,
Mhm.
do you send out emails with printable counting as I feel more comfortable with pencil and paper? That's the first question.
Yeah, so absolutely. You'll see it go up on the website a little bit closer to the count, but it'll, yeah, essentially be a tally sheet. And then we'll have kind of a mechanism for you to submit that data to us once you're done.
And the second related question is it a new app this year or an update to Counterpoint? What's happening with that? The app.
The app, yeah. So this year we're using a new app, and you'll be able to see that when I think, yeah, the link is in the chat to sign up for it. We're using a new app. It's a very similar kind of premise in terms of how it works, but the few key differences that I'll highlight is that we now have the sign up integrated within the app. So instead of using last year we used signup.com and then you kind of had to go and find your location, this year it's integrated right into the app. So you'll be able to see with the kind of GPS, like you'll be able to see on the map where your count location is. And then you'll have a little bit more kind of tutorial materials and reference stuff kind of within the app as well.
Okay,
And then
great.
the one other thing I'll say on the app is that it's a web app. So you'll be able to click on the link, and kind of use it in your browser super easily.
Okay, fantastic. There's just a comment here just a comment here from Joanna that says, thanks for the info, RE cities and towns. I asked because I saw Elliott Lake on the list, which is a small town near my hometown, Sault Ste. Marie, which isn't on the list. I'll connect with you and reach out to Clean North to see if there's interest availability in the soon.
Awesome.
So that's good.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just for everyone who's following along, the email has been in the chat a few different times, ppsv@velocanadabikes.org. If you're following along in the chat, it's in there a few different times, but the chat's going fast, so that's good. Okay, next question from Kate. Will there be another training webinar to learn how to use the new app and conduct a new count?
Yeah, so we're planning this one we were kind of focusing on the overall process of what we've done so far. In the next couple of weeks, you'll be seeing a lot of materials come out on social media, like with videos and pictures about how to do the count. So both on social media and through the newsletter and on the website. And then we're also planning another webinar for the last week of May, that will kind of have a little bit more of a focus on, like, when you go out to count, exactly how does it work? So I'll actually kind of open up the app and show you in a little bit more, I guess a little bit more on the, implementation side of how does the count actually happen. And I know that we'll be sending out an email after this webinar with just kind of all of the links. So we'll include kind of all that information there on how you can stay up to date.
Okay, fantastic. Very nerdy social media question, but that's okay. Love the social media. Is the pedal pole Blue Sky account bridged to Mastodon? Is pedal pole on Mastodon?
That I don't know. Samuel, do you know?
Nope.
No.
Nope. It has been suggested, but maybe if there's a volunteer, somebody who's familiar with the platform could reach out to us and maybe uh, give us an introduction on how to set that up. We could do that.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions in the? I don't see in the Q&A. Everyone's just in the chat. Okay, Regina says, I will send a bridge request. So watch for that. Samuel, I assume you're also the social media manager for VCB. So any other questions from anyone in the chat? Okay, there's instructions in the chat how to do it. Yeah, there was a question about the length of a shift that I think was answered in the chat. So in general, a counting shift is 2 hours for a specific shift.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question here. In Montreal, we have locations where we can have platoons of cyclists going through an intersection during one signal phase, i.e. possibly 50 or so cyclists passing the count line in 30 seconds. Not really obvious counting such locations. Should we just give up on such areas and focus on lower volume areas?
Um, so I guess there's a couple of things to think about there. Like there's, yeah, I mean, I guess is this like the concern is about whether it's possible to capture any and like concern that you might miss some or about choosing the locations. Maybe I'll look at because I get yeah, there's a few things. Like we encourage you to count whatever you think is the most kind of relevant. Um, it might be like that might be a location that you're seeing a lot of cyclists and you want to be able to capture that. You might be starting to see more like other types of micromobility devices that you want to be able to capture. You might also decide that, that one has great infrastructure and it's, well liked, well regarded. Maybe you want to focus your volunteer capacity elsewhere. Um, but yeah, I would definitely say there's any specific locations that you have questions about, reach out and we can have a chat about kind of the specific situations because there's a couple of different things that we think about when we go into changing locations.
Okay, great. And then someone says, we had lots of areas with huge this chat is hard to follow. Okay, there we go. Yeah, someone else answered. We had the same problem with cars in some areas. Pencil and paper work better because we could count in fives.
Mhm.
So you're not necessarily recording all the data. There was a question about the training. Yes, the training will happen at the end of May. Watch the social media and sign up for the app. Okay, and then Moreno says counts are intended to be midline screen line counts. Sampling too close to intersections create this large queue problem. Also, turning movement can create counting problems, so mid block is easier on both these fronts.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for raising that.
Yeah, even mid block will still get platoon effect.
That's good. That's something to celebrate that there's so many cyclists. That's a good problem to have.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Any other questions? So, reminder, the email to contact Amanda and Pedalpole is ppsv@velocanadabikes.org. If you have questions, there will be training at the end of the month, and sign up for the new app to get updated information and follow on social media. Vélo Canada Bikes, soon to be on Mastodon. Um, Fantastic. Well, this concludes our webinar. Thank you very much again to Amanda for being our speaker for today. And thank you all for joining us today. Really great participation from everyone in the audience. We hope you'll join future events from the CapaCITY-CapaCITÉ research team. You can reach out to info@capacity-capacité.ca to get information from our newsletter about upcoming webinars and find out more information about the research project. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Amanda.